Chapter 4, Friday, July 5th, 1771. It was more than 2 weeks before Marmaduke van Swearingen was able to walk again without the healing wounds on back, buttocks, and legs cracking open to leave him gasping in pain. He had remained unconscious until the morning after the gauntlet run. Even then, because of several wounds that became infected, he verged on delirium for 2 days more. The Shawnee had been surprised, but not because he had not completed the gauntlet run. Rather, they were deeply impressed that he had traveled it so far, much farther, in fact, than a number of full-grown men brought into captivity here and who had gone by. Though not much more than a boy, he was shown the respect afforded to a brave man. Under the care of squaws, now deeply concerned for his welfare, he recovered rapidly. They bathed his wounds repeatedly and gently rubbed a greasy, foul-smelling concoction which conquered the infection and encouraged healing. He was supremely happy. This was the day at last when he was to be officially adopted into the Shawnee tribe. He was to become a member of the Kispokatha sept of the tribe. Further, he was being adopted into the family of the chief himself, Puck-Sen-Wah. As with many Indian tribes, the Shawnee were divided into clan-like segments called septs. There were 5 of these septs, and each, though governed by itself, provided an important function to the tribe as a whole. The Pekui sept, for instance, had charge of maintaining order or duty and looked after celebrations of matters pertaining to Shawnee religion. The Mekuje sept controlled matters pertaining to health, medicine, and food. The 2 most powerful septs, having charge of all things political and all matters affecting the entire tribe, were the Thaigila and the Chalagatha septs. From one of them, the principal chief of the Shawnee nation had to come. The chiefs of all the other septs were under control of the principal chief in all tribal matters, but in matters affecting only their septs, they were independent chiefs. The final sept, the Kispokatha, was in charge of all circumstances of war. This included the preparation of warriors and the providing of a war chief for the entire tribe. It was a proud sept. The principal chief now was Chalagatha, named Hokoliskek, Cornstalk, whose village was nearby. He would be on hand today to witness the ceremonies and welcome Duke into the tribe, but it was the tribal war chief and chief of the Kispokatha sept, Puck-Sen-Wah, who would be in charge. Duke quickly learned that Puck-Sen-Wah was not only deeply loved and respected, his word was absolute law. He was a tall, strong man, noted for his kindness and generosity among his own people, and his deadly fierceness against enemies. Puck-Sen-Wah's wife, Methotassa, had borne him 6 children, but it was generally believed in the tribe that the chief was a favorite of Monito, the supreme being of all things. His oldest son, Chiksika, even though only 15, was already becoming noted for his strength and intelligence. Puck-Sen-Wah's 13-year-old daughter, Tecumseh, was now just beginning to bloom into the most beautiful maiden among the Kispokathas, if not the entire tribe. The second son of the chief had been born just 3 years ago last March. At that instant of his birth, a tremendous comet had seared the skies, a rare and inspiring omen, signifying greatness to come in the future of this chubby child. His name was Tecumseh. And as if Tecumseh's birth under the sign of the comet was not alone proof that Puck-Sen-Wah was favored by Monito, there could be no doubt of it since the last hunger moon, January, for that was when the chief's wife had given birth to triplet boys. It was an event never before recorded in Shawnee history. These matters of interest in the tribe and the sept were explained to Duke by Chiksika. They felt a natural boyish attraction for each other and a curiosity in each for the other's way of life. Duke told him about his own boyhood and family. The brow of the chief's son wrinkled as he listened. He was not able to understand such a family life as Duke's, where the members were at odds with one another, with little or no inter-family respect, courtesy, or love. He continued to ask Duke penetrating questions until they were interrupted. It was time for the adoption ceremonies to begin. With a promise to see him later and welcome him as his brother Chiksika left, Blacktooth, now brimming with friendliness and laughing often, took Duke to the riverbank where a large crowd had gathered. Once again he told him to strip. This time Duke did not have so much to remove, just a simple buckskin breechcloth that hung from his waist, and a peculiarly comfortable pair of slippers made of woven reeds. When he was finished, Blacktooth grinned and swatted him on the behind. "Wait here and just take what comes," he said. He strode to a nearby wiggiwa, disappeared into it briefly, came out and walked towards his own wiggiwa, not far from the Misikamiki. From wiggiwa comes the familiar term wigwam, which has come to mean practically the same thing as teepee. They were not the same. The Ohio Shawnee never lived in teepees. Their wiggiwa were square, rectangular structures of poles and treated bark, non-portable, cool in summer, warm in winter, easily erected, easily abandoned if the need came, yet stronger and roomier than a mere teepee. Duke's embarrassment over having to stand there naked became even worse when, a minute or two later, a trio of young squaws carrying paint pots left the first wiggiwa and approached him. As he stood there stiffly, blushing deeply, they painted him all over with a variety of colors, giggling almost uncontrollably as they worked. As soon as they finished, however, they snatched up their paint pots and vanished in the crowd of amused onlookers. Then Puck-Sin-Wah strode through the crowd to him. He was dressed in a simple but beautiful doeskin blouse and leggings. A cluster of 5 dark brown, white-tipped eagle feathers were anchored to the back of his head and hung tips down over his right shoulder. The doeskin garments were so beautifully worked that they had become almost white, immaculately clean and so soft they were almost like velvet. A heavy necklace of hand-beaten silver encircled his neck, and on his feet were buckskin moccasins sewn with designs of brightly colored beads and decorated with porcupine quills. And there was one other ornamentation he wore attached to his waist, a hoop to which were attached no less than a dozen scalps. The chief's movements were graceful, almost cat-like, giving the impression of great muscular strength and coordination always in reserve. He stopped several feet in front of Duke and raised both arms. The onlookers became silent, and then Puck-Sin-Wah began the sing-song chant of an ancient rite. The youth understood little of it, except for the last phrases, which were Nui Kantipa, Weshi Manitou, Weshi Ketwilu, Ku Weshi Walopai. The Great Spirit is the friend of the Indians. Let us always do good. This ritual completed, Puck-Sin-Wah handed Duke into the care of 3 more squaws. These women were clad only in a type of pantaloon reaching from waist to knee. One was young and quite pretty, another middle-aged and with a stern expression. The third was a very old woman, entirely toothless, and her face deeply wrinkled under the eyes and mouth with the lines of laughter. The squaws led him into the water up to his waist, where they abruptly jumped upon him, pulling and tugging until he was knocked off balance and went under. The bottom here was more gravelly than muddy, and as he rose sputtering, they scooped up handfuls of fine pebbles and sand and scrubbed him with great energy. Not only was the paint rubbed away, but his skin became a bright pink from the scouring. Then he was permitted to return to shore. During the entire part of the washing, many of the spectators had grunted and nodded approval, but soon they had begun drifting away, and by the time the minor ordeal was over, most of the Indians had vanished. Blacktooth, however, had returned. Still dripping and oddly refreshed, Duke was led by Blacktooth and followers of the squaws to the Misikamiki. There they dressed him in a beautiful tasseled buckskin shirt, softer than any he had ever felt, and a pair of heavier buckskin leggings decorated with beads and ribbons, porcupine quills, and hanks of red hair. Once again his face was painted, but this time with care. On his cheeks and forehead, across nose and chin, were painted lines and spots of a brilliant red, dull blue, deep yellow, and pasty white. The thick black hair at the back of his head was woven through the perforations of a thin metal disc the diameter of a walnut. Into a small hole in its center they inserted an eagle feather so that it projected down at an angle, its tip resting across his right shoulder. As this was being done, the Indians, over 600 men from Kispoko Town, Cornstalks Town, and Nonhelima's Town, entered the Misikamiki clad in their finest and sat cross-legged on the floor of beaten earth. They whispered and smiled, and now and then pointed toward him. The voices stilled suddenly as Puck-Sin-Wah came in. Following him was his second-in-command, Chief Shiminito, Black Snake, and behind him was Chiksika. As the 3 took their places in the center of the room close to where Duke was sitting beside Blacktooth, Chiksika flashed a quick, bright smile and gave Duke a little nod. Duke returned the greeting. At a wave of Puck-Sin-Wah's hand, the 3 squaws, still hovering close to Duke, scurried down the narrow aisle and out the door, dropping a thick buffalo hide into place behind them. There was now a heavy stillness in the dim room. The chief of the Kispokotha, Shawnee, arose from where he had seated and walked over to Duke. He took the youth's hand and led him to the bear skin upon which he, Black Snake, and Chiksika had been sitting. At a motion of the chief's head, Duke sat beside Chiksika, and Puxinwa himself sat in the center. The war chief then handed Duke a pipe tomahawk decorated with blue-tinted feathers, a small bag containing punk, flint, and steel for fire-making, and a pouch made of the entire pelt of a skunk, which had been skinned pocket fashion. The tail hung down beneath it, and the white stripes on the black rose and converged at the mouth of the pouch. The bag was filled with kinikinik, the shredded and dried leaves of tobacco, sumac, willow, and dogwood combined in an aromatic blend. Pipes similar to the one the chief had given him were now being lighted all over the room. At a nod from Puxinwa, Duke filled his with the kinikinik. Then he lighted his punk with the flint and steel, and with this he lighted his pipe and puffed shallowly. Until every pipe had been smoked out and placed on the floor beside its owner, not a word further was spoken by anyone. By that time the room had taken on a bluish haze from the smoke, but to Duke's surprise it was not at all unpleasant. At last Puxinwa rose from his sitting position. He looked to right and left, and there was the feeling that he had managed to look directly and deeply into the eyes of everyone present. He spoke then in a strong, measured tone, clearly audible to everybody assembled here. "My son, you are now flesh of our flesh and bone of our bone. By the ceremony which was performed this day, every drop of white blood was washed out of your veins. You are taken into the Shawnee nation and initiated into a warrior sept. You are adopted into a great family, and now received with great seriousness and solemnity in this room and presence and place of a great man." Marmaduke felt overwhelmed and close to tears. "After what has passed this day," Puxinwa continued, "you are now one of us, by an old strong law and custom. My son, you have nothing to fear. We are now under the same obligation to love and defend one another. Therefore, you are to consider yourself as one of our people, and forevermore to be known and respected as Weya Piersimwa, Blue Jacket." Chapter 5. Saturday, June 5th, 1773. His life among the Shawnee was everything Blue Jacket had hoped it would be, and even more. He had adopted the Indian life every bit as completely as the Indians had adopted him. Rare were the times now when he thought of himself as ever having been a white boy named Marmaduke Van Swearingen. Nor had any of the Kispokotha Shawnee, since the day of his adoption ceremony nearly 2 years ago, ever mentioned the fact that he was born white. In truth, their belief in the adoption right was so strong that to each and every one of them, Blue Jacket was an Indian, just as much as Shawnee, as Chiksika, Blacktooth, Black Snake, or even Puxinwa himself. To the tribe's way of thinking, Blue Jacket was born a Shawnee on the day of his adoption, and he had no life previous to that. And though it was more difficult for him, even Blue Jacket himself was coming to feel this way. In the 2 years since he had left his white background behind him, he had adapted himself unusually well to the social, moral, political, and religious beliefs and customs of the Shawnee. In all cases, he considered them far superior to those of the whites, simpler and more honest. Within 8 or 9 months, he had become so fluent in the Shawnee tongue that he had no difficulty understanding even the concepts of Indian mythology or in making himself understood in any manner he wished to discuss. And now, after 2 years, without even realizing it, he was even thinking in Shawnee terms and in Shawnee tongue, sharp of mind, quick of body, generous, even-tempered, and considerate. Blue Jacket soon became extremely popular. He entered all the sports, habits, games, and labors of his fellows with such enthusiasm and cheerfulness and with such respect for others that he began to have a considerable following. More and more frequently, he was invited to take part in the sept and tribal councils. Much of the credit for this had gone to Puxinwa himself, who spent many hours and days instructing him in the history and culture of the Shawnee and in the religion which played such an important part in their lives. In his white life, the youth had hated school in general and history in particular, but this was something different, and he virtually ate it up. Puck-Sen-Wah taught him the history, traditions, and codes of the tribe strictly by word of mouth, since nothing was written down. Nor was it enough that he merely be told of these matters. He must, as was custom, commit them to memory so perfectly that he could repeat them exactly, without nothing added, changed, or left out. Only in this way could the tribe's history be passed accurately from one generation to another. The supreme being of all things, Puck-Sen-Wah told him, is Monito. It is Monito himself who rules Yalak-Kumigigi, the universe, and he dispenses his blessings and favors to those who earn his goodwill, just as he brings unspeakable sorrow to those who conduct merits his displeasure. Monito, the chief added, is not to be mistaken for the Great Spirit, or ruler of destinies, who is subordinate to him. The Great Spirit, whose name is Inima Sila Miwano, is a grandmother who is constantly weaving an immense net, which is called Eskimota. When this net is finished, it will be lowered to the earth, and all who have proven themselves worthy will be gathered into its folds and taken to a world of great peace and happiness. At the same time, an unspeakable terrible fate will overtake the rest of the world as it comes to an end. Good conduct always brings reward, just as evil conduct always brings sorrow. No one, Puck-Sen-Wah continued, is forced to believe in these matters, Blue Jacket. Force is not necessary. We know them to be true. Morality is a fixed law, but each of us is his own judge. From earliest childhood, this is instilled in our minds, just as we are taught that deceitfulness is a crime of itself. We live according to our standards and principles, not for what others might think of us. Absolute honesty towards others of our tribe is the basis of our character. The standards of conduct are strictly followed. Puck-Sen-Wah's voice was gentle and compelling, and Blue Jacket found himself hanging on every word the chief uttered. Everything he said seemed to be so logical and clear. The foundation of our existence, Puck-Sen-Wah said slowly, is this. Do not kill or injure your neighbor, for it is not him that you injure yourself. But do good to him. Therefore add to his days of happiness as you add to your own. Do not wrong or hate your neighbor, for it is not him that you wrong yourself. But love him, for Monito loves him also as he loves you. There was no such thing as a jail among the Shawnee, Blue Jacket learned, but misdeeds did not go unpunished. The punishments were of many kinds and determined by the type of offense. The chief's word was the absolute law, and any persistent refusal to obey him or the unwritten code of honorable conduct was punishable by severe flogging or even death. Anyone refusing voluntarily to take his punishment like a man was exiled from the tribe, and to a Shawnee this was a fate much worse than execution. Nor were the women of the tribe free from the law. The most deceitful crime of which any woman could be convicted was pakvenomadiwe, gossip about people. Blue Jacket was impressed at the many points of similarity between the Shawnee religion and Christianity. The greatest single difference was that his people, and now he firmly considered the Shawnee to be his people, believed they were responsible only for their conduct towards their own race. To other races they owed nothing except to return the same treatment that they received. Puck-Sen-Wah was not the only instructor Blue Jacket had. Almost everyone he encountered was more than willing to help him learn the Shawnee ways. Men such as Black Snake and Blacktooth and Muga, the bear, went out of their way to help him, and even from Chiksika, 2 years younger than himself, he learned a great deal. What Chiksika had learned in the years with his father, he made every effort to pass on to Blue Jacket. He taught him keenness of observation and how to bear pain without grimace. He taught him how to bear loss without depression, danger without fear, and triumph without pride. Most of all, he taught him mastery of self, the need to control and direct his passions and not let them rule him. Together they fished in the streams and roamed through woods and fields. With other youngsters they learned the methods of making war, of stealthy approach, of ambush, and of fierce attack against foes much larger in numbers. Chiksika taught him the art of tracking, stalking, and hunting game, building traps and deadfalls and snares, and he taught him how to accurately foretell the weather, the names of plants and trees, birds, and four-legged animals. He showed him how to find roots that were edible and what plants could cure illnesses or blunt the knife of pain. He learned the names and meanings of the 13 moons of the Shawnee year, and that each year began in spring with the green moon. From Puck-Sen-Wa's wife, Methotassa, and from their lovely daughter, Tecumseh, he learned the value of patience and the need to have pity for those unfortunate or in his power. They taught him the essentials of honesty, especially honesty to self, in all matters, and the value of speaking truth at all times. Cruelty, for the sake of cruelty, whether to animals or to man, degraded a person. The man who cheated or stole or lied could never secure the most priceless possession of a Shawnee, honor among his fellows and in his own soul. The most important lesson of all, taught him by everyone, was that of respect for his elders, a trait which went hand in hand with respect for authority. This meant not only respect for one's parents and chief, but for any person of the tribe who began to show advanced years. Such people were always assumed some degree of importance and authority, and when talking was engaged in, whether in councils or just around the campfires, it was always the older people who spoke first, and they were listened to carefully, and their wisdom and advice deeply respected. Having respect for the aged became second nature to Blue Jacket. All of this was tremendously interesting to him, but what fascinated him most were the occasional tribal councils which were called, and to which twice now he had accompanied Puck-Sen-Wa. These councils were held in the principal village of the Chalagatha sept, the village called Chillicothe, on the banks of the Little Miami River. This is the site of present Old Town, Ohio, 3 miles south of present Xenia, which is the seat of Greene County, Ohio. The Shawnee village was near the junction of present Massey's Creek and the Little Miami River. This was where Blackfish was chief, and Blackfish also seemed second principal chief of the whole Shawnee nation under Hokolesqua Cornstalk. To these grand councils came the chiefs, sub-chiefs, and braves of every sept. At each of the 2 such meetings he had attended, Blue Jacket had estimated the number gathered to be about 5,000. These councils were deadly serious. Their business affected the tribe as a whole, and the problem confronting them now was the gravest one they had ever encountered. For 18 years now, tribal representatives had been meeting here at intervals in an effort to decide what the Shawnee as a nation must do about the white man. Despite treaties forbidding it, the whites were crossing the mountains to the east and spilling into the valleys of the Monongahela and the Allegheny, a wave of white settlers flooding the Shawnee land, killing their game, destroying their forests and fields. No problem before had ever caused so wide a rift in the tribe as this. In fact, it was such a serious problem that it threatened to cause a permanent break in the nation. Cornstalk, as principal chief, was backed up by both the Chalagathas and the Maykujis when he declared, quote, "We had better make peace with the white people, as they are outnumbering us and increasing fast. It seems Moneta is with them. Let us make peace with them and be always in peace with them." "No," replied Puck-Sen-Wa for the Kispokatha sept, and he was echoed by the chiefs of the Pekui and the Thawagila septs. "No, let us not make peace with the white people. Let us defend our lands and fight until one or the other of us is destroyed to the last man." Puck-Sen-Wa shook his head sorrowfully as his gaze took in the whole assemblage. "To the very marrow of my bones, I know there can never be true peace between Indians and whites. As surely as summer follows spring, the whites will not stop at the river valleys of what they now call western Pennsylvania, but which was once our land and is now no more. Inevitably, they must spread down the Spewelathepe to settle in our great and sacred hunting grounds, the Kentucky. Our tribe from the north and the Cherokee from the south might share the boundary of that land below our great river, but no tribe or white man is permitted to take up residence there." Puck-Sen-Wa now appealed to his thousands of listeners with all the directness and force that was in him. "My tribesmen, my brothers, have not over 100 summers of friction between Indians and whites proved that nothing can be gained for us by talks of peace? The whites are always asking to talk peace and eager to make treaties, but whenever we have agreed and treaties have been signed and boundaries established in the past, have not these same very whites treated us with loathing and humiliated us? And in every case, have they not broken the treaty boundaries almost immediately after they were established? Think, my brothers, and remember, and then talk not to me of peace with the white man. Blue Jacket was moved by the words of his chief, as were many others present, but although the last council had lasted for almost a month, no final decision had been made on the matter. For his own part, Blue Jacket sided with Pucks and Wah. He realized, because of his white heritage and because he knew what the whites were like, that his chief had spoken the truth. The white settlers would come, and nothing except a united Indian force facing them could possibly hold them back, perhaps not even that. On the way back to Quispoko Town, Chicksika told Blue Jacket, "Father will never make peace with the whites, regardless of what the tribe does. He is my father, and I will ride with him." And I, too, vowed Blue Jacket.